Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome to a very exciting video because this is the start of a brand new series where I'll be building my very first 009 narrow gauge layout. I'm really excited to say that this episode is sponsored by Derails. It's great to have them on board for this series, and I'm going to be talking about them a bit more in a little bit, but for now, let's dive in with what exactly 009 is. Now, the best way to explain it is that it's pretty much exactly the same scale as 00 gauge, 4mm to the foot. But these are narrow gauge trains which are much smaller, and so they run on 9mm end gauge track instead, hence 009. Now, the way I like to visualise it is that if you have a 00 gauge figure standing next to a 00 gauge loco, they're both in the same scale, right? Well, if you put that same figure next to a 009 loco, he isn't suddenly a giant. The scale is the same, but the locos themselves are much smaller. Now, a few years ago, right as I was getting back into the hobby, I took a trip to Wales to visit some of the iconic narrow gauge railways there, such as the Ffestiniog, the Welsh Highland Railway, the Talyllyn Railway. It was honestly one of the best trips I've ever done, and if you've never been, I would highly recommend it. I came away from that trip very much enthusiastic about narrow gauge, and since then a 009 layout has always been something I've been wanting to build. But if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know I'm somewhat lacking in space. I just about have enough room for my main 00 gauge layout, but any more layouts would have to be small. And then one day I was out walking the dog and I came across a wooden suitcase that had been left on the pavement outside someone's house with a sign saying it was free for anyone to take. And I swear this is absolutely true. I saw it and immediately thought, I could build a layout in that. So I brought it home, I gave it a bit of a clean, and yeah, I'm going to attempt to build a 009 layout inside a suitcase, which I just think sounds like such a fun project. Not only is it a brand new gauge for me, but unlike my larger main layout, this is going to be very small and self-contained, but hopefully still interesting, so it's definitely going to be a challenge. Anyway, that's all the backstory that has inspired this new layout build series, but now let's take a look at everything I've got in stock and I'll show you exactly what it is that I'm planning. So this is the suitcase, and it's pretty solid, which is great for housing a layout. After all, it's essentially just a big box painted in a very vivid yellow colour, which I don't think will be staying. Inside there's a decent amount of space, and after a bit of measuring and cutting of wood, I've created a baseboard that fits neatly inside. This is roughly 80 centimeters by 50 centimeters, and I built this using the standard technique that I've shown in previous videos. My plan is to build the layout on the board outside of the suitcase, and then once it's complete I can put it back inside and add on the finishing touches. Of course, I'm not going to get very far with just a blank baseboard, so here are some of the supplies I've got in for building this layout. Now you'll see all of this stuff in much more detail over the course of the next few weeks, but I think the thing that will interest you the most is the name of the layout. As you can see, I've had these signs made up by Scale Model Scenery, and I've decided to call the layout Go for Tin. Naturally, it's a Welsh name, and in English that translates roughly to tight space, which I thought was appropriate. You'll also notice I have some track and plenty of points too, all from Peco's 009 range. I'll be using their smaller set track points throughout the layout, which isn't ideal, but I do need all the space I can get to create an interesting track plan. And speaking of the plan, let me show you what I have in mind. So like I said earlier, the layout is roughly 80 centimeters by 50 centimeters. I'd like to have continuous running on this layout, so I'm planning for it to be a basic circuit. The curves are going to be tight though. This is much smaller than Peco's first radius curves, so I'm going to have to be careful that they don't cause the locos to derail. The circuit will then have a loop on either side, the back one being for a hidden fiddle yard, while the one at the front will be for a very small station. Coming off this loop is a small spur, which I think will be long enough to hold a loco, so maybe an engine shed can go here. And then on the left hand side, I'm going to have another point that will lead round an incredibly tight curve into two sidings behind the platform. From a scenic point of view though, the plan is to have a hill hiding the fiddle yard with the track disappearing into a tunnel on either side. The hill will also create a nice scenic break, but I'll have to be careful I don't go too high with this as I still need it to fit inside the suitcase. So, now that you're all caught up with what I have in mind, let's get on with laying some track. So as you can see, I've got all the points out of the packets and in place on the layout. Because these need to be in specific positions, I'm going to lay these first and then fill in the gaps with the flexi track afterwards. As I want to add motors to the points, I've marked out each of their positions, and now I'm going to drill a hole for the operating arm to pass through later on. And with the holes drilled, the points were then all nailed into position just using a few track pins. One thing I did notice is that for these 009 points, and presumably N gauge points as well, the hole is on the end of the tie bar rather than in the centre like on 00 gauge points. So now I have a very strange looking layout with a lot of disconnected points, so let's connect these up. Again, I'm using Peco track for this, and all I'm doing here is marking the flexi track to the required length. Over on the workbench, I'll then use the Dremel to cut the section of track I need. With a few sleepers removed from the end of this section, I'm now going to add some solder to each rail. This is so I can attach dropper wires which will feed power to each section of track. Back on the layout, I'm now going to drill 2 holes for each dropper wire so they can pass through the baseboard for wiring up later on. Now I can install the track, first pushing the wires through the 2 holes I just made, and then using fish plates to connect it up to the point. And with a bit of bending, I was able to join up the other end of the track too. And all that was left was to fix the track down using some track pins as before. Since the flexi track doesn't have any pre-made holes like the points do, I like to make a little pilot hole first. This then allows me to get the track pin into position, which makes it much easier to nail down. After this, it was a case of repeating this process round the entire layout, joining up all the gaps between each point.
As I mentioned earlier, the curves were the sections I was worried about the most, but I'm actually pleasantly surprised that they don't look too bad. The worst one, of course, is the very tight bend into the sidings. I think larger locos will certainly struggle with this section, but the curve is smooth enough that I think smaller 040 locos will be able to handle it. And I also added on the spur to the end of the station loop for the engine shed. I've given this a very slight bend to let it follow the running line, and I think it might be a nice opportunity for a small cameo scene at the very front of the layout. The two sidings in the middle of the layout were the very last sections to be laid, and these were nice and easy to do since they only had to connect up to the point at one end. Again, these have a slight bend to them as well, just to make the most use of the space. And so in a fairly short amount of time, I've got all of the track laid. But before I can run any trains, I need to get some power to the track, which means sorting out the wiring.
Now, I just want to take a quick moment to once again thank Derails for sponsoring this episode of Building a 009 Layout. Derails is a fantastic model shop, and I can honestly say that they're one of my favourite retailers to use. All the track that you just saw me laying on the baseboard, that was all bought from Derails, and they have a fantastic range of not only 009 items, but also N-gauge, 00, even stuff for larger garden railways too. And I think one of the things I like most about using Derails is not only their phenomenal customer service, which is really second to none in my opinion, but also if your order is over £20, you get free delivery too, which is absolutely brilliant, and I don't think there are any other model railway shops that do that. So, if you need some supplies for your own layout, then visit their website at derails.co.uk. There's a link to that down in the description, along with all of the products that I've used from them in this video. Thanks again to Derails for sponsoring this episode, and now let's head back to the layout and I'll wire up the track I just laid.
First, I'm going to tip the baseboard up onto its side so I can get nice easy access to all the wires underneath. And that is one of the advantages of smaller layouts like this, is that you can turn them over to get to the underside. Now I'm using a similar wiring method that I used on my main layout, in that initially this will be wired for analog control, but I'll build in the option of converting it over to DCC in the future. So first I'm going to have a set of bus wires that run round the length of the entire layout, and I'm keeping these nice and neat by running them through these cable clips. With the two bus wires installed, I'm going to connect the female end of a T-tap terminal to them, close to where the dropper wires come through the baseboard. These simply slot over the wires, and then I'm just using a pair of pliers to clip them together. The droppers themselves then have the male end of these terminals crimped onto each wire. And then these have a push-fit connection into the female terminals I just installed. And I have these connections pretty much on every single piece of track around the layout. The idea is that if each of these droppers are disconnected from the bus wires, the power on the layout comes from a single feed and is routed by switching the points, so I can isolate locos in sidings or loops. If the droppers are all plugged in though, then the entire layout will be live, which is perfect for DCC operation. And these T-tap terminals are really useful for jobs like this, and I've provided a link down in the description below if you want to try them out for yourself. With the track all wired up though, I'm now finally ready to run my very first train on the layout.
So I've got all the wiring done now, and as you can see the baseboard is the right way up again with all the track on it. And actually this has come out looking pretty much like what I designed.
I think the great thing as well is that even though this is quite a small compact baseboard and there's a lot crammed into this design, it doesn't feel like it's all squished together. It actually feels quite well spaced, which I wasn't expecting it to be, so I'm really pleased with that. One thing I am worried about though, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, is the tightness of the curves. And this may be a narrow gauge layout, but 009 still does have its limits. As I was laying the track, I did try and get the curves as smooth as possible, and they don't look ridiculously tight. I was also pushing a wagon around as well at the same time, and it didn't feel like there were any tight spots or anything that might cause too much of an issue. So the wagon was all fine, but now we need to find out if a loco will actually run. And you can see I've got a little loco on the track just there, and this might look a little bit familiar to some of you. It's actually a 3D printed body kit that you then put on top of a Peco chassis, and it's very loosely based on the LNER J70, also perhaps better known as Toby from Thomas the Tank Engine. Now, of course, they were standard gauge engines. This is narrow gauge, so, you know, it's not an exact replica, but yeah, it's a really nice little simple kit, but I do think it is going to be a good loco to test the layout with. And so I've got my Gauge Master controller here, so let's turn up the power, and we can see things do move. Excellent. We'll flip that point so it can keep going around the circuit. And it's on the fiddle yard loop at the moment, and now coming back round the other side. And yeah, everything seems to be working there. That's fantastic. So we know that a loco, certainly a little 040 loco like this, will actually be quite happy running around the layout. That's fantastic. This is the first time I've actually run it around the layout. So I didn't know how that was going to go, and I'm really pleased that this is working. It shows that my wiring and my soldering skills aren't as terrible as I actually think they are. I do generally think that with any layout it's really important to get trains running as soon as possible. Not only does it allow you to check everything's working as expected, but when you see a train actually running on the track, it just builds your enthusiasm. Now I'm going to stop this loco here and send it in reverse back round the layout, and that's because there's one final part of the track to test, which is the two sidings and that very sharp curve that leads into them. So I'm going to flip the points, and fingers crossed the loco will be able to make it round here. And that's brilliant. I'm really pleased that this tram engine can get round that curve, and you can see that the power is also getting through to the siding too. I'm going to do the same now just to test the other siding, and I'll run the loco through that curve really slowly just to see if there's any problems. And yeah, it doesn't look like there are any tight spots in the curve there, so that's great if at least 040s can get round it, and who knows, maybe some of my larger locos will be able to manage it too. So I've made a lot of progress today, and I think this is a good place to leave it for now, but if you're really excited to see where this project goes, well, channel members on the driver and fireman tiers are going to get early access to all the new episodes in this series, so click that join button below this video if you want to see the next episode before everyone else. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and here's a look at what's coming up in the next video. The station gets a platform, I try out a new track weathering technique, and things don't go to plan. It's a total disaster, and it could throw the whole project into jeopardy.